October 6, 1943, 22:30 hours. The waters west of Vella Lavella Island. The night was black silk, the kind of darkness that existed only in the South Pacific, where the nearest electric light was 100 miles away, and the stars above seemed close enough to touch. The sea moved in long, oily swells, phosphorescence trailing from the bows of 6 American destroyers as they cut through the water at 27 knots. The air smelled of salt and diesel fuel, and the peculiar metallic tang that came before storms. In the distance, thunder rumbled, not from clouds, but from Japanese destroyers somewhere in the darkness, their engines reverberating across the water like the growl of distant predators. On the bridge of the USS Selfridge, Captain Ralph Walker stood with his hands braced against the chart table, watching the radar repeater with the focus of a man who understood that the green blips on that screen represented the difference between life and death. His task force, 6 destroyers organized into 2 divisions, was racing northwest to intercept a Japanese evacuation force attempting to extract troops from Vella Lavella. Intelligence said the Japanese would have 9 destroyers and smaller craft. Walker had 6. The mathematics were not favorable. But mathematics had become less important in the Solomon Islands campaign by October 1943. What mattered was timing, technology, and the willingness to close with an enemy who had proven, time and again, that they would fight to the last shell, the last torpedo, the last man. At 22:31, Walker's radar officer called out contacts, bearing 315 degrees, range 20,000 yards. 9 ships moving fast, heading south. The Japanese evacuation force, exactly where intelligence said it would be. Walker gave the order to increase speed to 30 knots and alter course to intercept. The American destroyers surged forward, their wakes boiling white in the darkness, turbines screaming as engineers pushed machinery to its limits. This would be the last major surface engagement in the Solomon Islands campaign. The final act in a year-long struggle for control of these jungle islands that most Americans had never heard of before the war. It would be fought with the weapons and tactics that had evolved over dozens of night battles, radar against instinct, guns against torpedoes, steel against steel in darkness so complete that men would die without ever seeing the ships that killed them. This is the story of the Battle of Vella Lavella, the closing chapter of a campaign that transformed the U.S. Navy from a force reeling from Pearl Harbor into the most powerful maritime service in history. It is not a story of great victories or crushing defeats. It is a story of the grinding, brutal work of naval warfare, of ships damaged and men killed in pursuit of objectives that seemed small but added up to something larger. It is the story of how the Japanese Navy, once the dominant force in the Pacific, fought its last major surface action in the Solomons with courage and skill, and lost anyway, because courage and skill could no longer overcome the systematic advantages of American radar, production, and doctrine. And it is the story of a sound, the thunder of 5-inch guns firing in rapid succession, that would fade from these waters after October 6th. As the campaign moved northwest, leaving behind wrecked ships and drowned men, and the slow realization that the tide of war, which had turned at Midway and Guadalcanal, would never turn back. To understand October 6, 1943, you must first understand Vella Lavella, an island most strategists had never intended to fight over. It was a volcanic outcrop northwest of Kolombangara, covered in dense jungle, inhabited by a few hundred Melanesian villages, possessing no strategic value except its position. It sat between the major Japanese base at Rabaul and the American advance moving up the Solomons chain. By September 1943, the Allies had developed a new strategy: bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions, seize lightly defended islands behind them, and let the bypassed garrisons wither. It was called leapfrogging or island hopping, and it was designed to conserve American lives and accelerate the advance toward Japan. Vella Lavella was perfect for this strategy, lightly garrisoned, close enough to Kolombangara to threaten Japanese supply lines, far enough from Rabaul to make it difficult for the Japanese to reinforce quickly. American forces landed on Vella Lavella on August 15, 1943, meeting minimal resistance. Within weeks, they had constructed an airfield and established a base that made the Japanese garrison on Kolombangara untenable. The Japanese, recognizing that Kolombangara could no longer be held, decided to evacuate, not surrender, never surrender, but withdraw the troops to fight another day. This decision set the stage for the Battle of Vella Lavella. The Japanese would run an evacuation operation, similar to the Tokyo Express supply runs that had characterized the Solomons campaign, but in reverse. Destroyers would dash down the slot, embark troops from staging areas, and race back north before American aircraft could intercept at dawn. It was dangerous, but it was the only option. The troops on Vella Lavella and Kolombangara were too valuable to abandon, too well trained to sacrifice for no tactical gain. The Americans, monitoring Japanese radio traffic through signals intelligence, knew the evacuation was coming. They positioned destroyers to intercept. The stage was set for the last major surface engagement, in a campaign that had seen more night battles than any other theater of World War II. The Japanese evacuation force that sailed toward Vella Lavella on the night of October 6th consisted of 9 destroyers organized into 2 groups. The first group, 3 destroyers under Rear Admiral Matsuji Ijuin, would screen the evacuation. The second group, 6 destroyers, 4 of which were older, smaller vessels designed for high-speed transport, would embark the troops and evacuate them to Rabaul. Ijuin was an experienced commander who had participated in multiple Tokyo Express runs. He understood the risks. American radar gave the enemy a decisive advantage in night combat, allowing them to detect and engage Japanese ships before being detected themselves. But he also understood that the troops on Vella Lavella had no other hope of escape. The evacuation had to succeed. His plan was straightforward: use his 3 screening destroyers to engage any American forces, buying time for the transport destroyers to load troops and escape. It was a sacrifice mission. The screening destroyers would likely be damaged or sunk, but if the evacuation succeeded, their loss would be acceptable. It was the kind of calculation that Japanese commanders made repeatedly in 1943 and 1944, trading ships and men for time, for objectives that grew smaller and less significant as American power grew. The mathematics of attrition were brutal. Japan could not replace losses at anything close to the rate the Americans could. Every ship sunk, every pilot killed, every experienced sailor lost was a permanent degradation of capability. But what alternative was there? Surrender was unthinkable. Abandoning troops was dishonorable. So the Japanese fought knowing they were losing, hoping that each tactical success might delay the inevitable collapse. As Ijuin's force approached Vella Lavella at 22:30, his lookouts scanned the darkness for signs of American ships. They saw nothing, but the Americans, their radar sweeping the sea, saw everything. The American force that intercepted Ijuin consisted of 6 destroyers in 2 divisions. The first division, Selfridge, Chevalier, and O'Bannon, was commanded by Captain Frank Walker. The second division, Ralph Talbot, Taylor, and Lavalette, was led by Commander Harold Larson. They were modern Fletcher-class destroyers, heavily armed with 5 5-inch guns, torpedo tubes, and sophisticated radar that could detect targets at over 20 miles. Walker's plan was to use radar to detect the Japanese force early, close to torpedo range, and launch a coordinated attack that would overwhelm the enemy before they could respond effectively. It was standard American doctrine by October 1943, refined through dozens of engagements into a system that leveraged American technological advantages while minimizing exposure to Japanese torpedoes. At 22:31, radar contact was established. The Japanese were approximately 10 miles away, moving south at high speed. Walker ordered his destroyers to increase speed and turn toward the enemy. At 22:45, range had decreased to 7 miles, within torpedo range for both sides. Walker ordered his ships to launch torpedoes and open fire with their main batteries. The night exploded with light and sound. 15 5-inch guns fired simultaneously, their muzzle flashes illuminating the darkness for a fraction of a second before plunging everything back into blackness. The shells arced across the water, guided by fire control radar that had calculated range, bearing and rate of change with mechanical precision. 20 seconds later, they began falling among the Japanese destroyers. The Japanese, caught by surprise, responded with characteristic aggression. Unable to detect the Americans on their primitive radar, they turned toward the gun flashes and increased speed, closing the range, preparing to launch torpedoes. It was the standard Japanese response: when in doubt, attack. When unable to see the enemy, close the range until you can. When outnumbered or outgunned, rely on the superior range and power of the Type 93 long-lance torpedo to even the odds. At 22:47, the Japanese destroyer Yugumo was hit by American shells. Fire erupted along her superstructure. Her forward magazine exploded, and she began settling by the bow. But even as she died, she launched her torpedoes, 8 long-lance torpedoes, each carrying 1,080 pounds of explosive, running at 49 knots toward the American destroyers. Those torpedoes, launched by a dying ship from an enemy that was losing the war, would prove that courage and weapons design could still inflict terrible damage, even when the strategic situation was hopeless. At 22:50, a long-lance torpedo struck the USS Chevalier in her forward magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. The entire bow section forward of the bridge disintegrated. Flames shot 200 feet into the air. Men were killed instantly, vaporized by the blast or drowned as the forward compartments flooded in seconds. The ship lost power, lost steering, and began drifting dead in the water, her crew fighting fires and trying to keep her afloat. Behind her, the USS O'Bannon swerved to avoid the drifting wreck, but she was moving too fast. The range was too close. At 22:51, the O'Bannon collided with the Chevalier, her bow smashing into the Chevalier's port side. The collision caused massive damage to both ships. The Chevalier's hull was torn open, accelerating her flooding. The O'Bannon's bow was crushed, though she remained operational. And then, at 22:52, another long-lance torpedo struck the USS Selfridge, hitting her bow. The explosion tore away everything forward of the bridge: 50 feet of bow, the forward gun mount, the anchor chains. 54 men died instantly. The ship, now missing her entire bow, somehow remained afloat, her crew working frantically to seal bulkheads and prevent further flooding. In less than 3 minutes, the American force had lost 1 destroyer sunk and 2 heavily damaged. The tactical situation had reversed. The Americans, who had entered the battle with numerical and technological superiority, were now fighting for survival, but they kept fighting. The O'Bannon, despite her damaged bow, turned back toward the Japanese destroyers and opened fire with her remaining guns. The Ralph Talbot, Taylor, and Lavalette from the 2nd Division engaged the Japanese screening force, their guns firing as fast as the crews could load. The range was closing, 5,000 yards. 3,000 yards, close enough to see the enemy by the light of muzzle flashes and burning ships. The Japanese destroyer Shigur, Rear Admiral Idjwan's flagship, maneuvered brilliantly, dodging salvos, returning fire, launching torpedoes. The destroyers Samidar and Isokaze followed her lead, fighting with the aggressive, almost reckless tactics that characterized Japanese destroyer doctrine. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and their mission was not to win the battle, but to buy time for the evacuation destroyers to load troops and escape. They succeeded. While the American destroyers engaged Idjwan's screening force, the Japanese transport destroyers embarked troops from staging points on Vella Lavella and withdrew northwest, untouched. By 2315 they were gone, racing back toward Rabaul, with 589 soldiers who would live to fight another day. The screening destroyers, their mission accomplished, broke off the engagement and followed. The Shigur, Samidar, and Isokazi turned north and increased speed, laying smoke screens, maneuvering to avoid American torpedoes. By 2330, they had disengaged, leaving behind the burning wrecks of the Yugumo and the American destroyers. The Battle of Vella Lavella was over. It had lasted less than an hour. The Japanese had lost one destroyer, sunk. The Americans had lost one destroyer, sunk, and two heavily damaged. But the strategic outcome was clear. The Japanese evacuation had succeeded. The troops from Vella Lavella and Kolombangara were safely withdrawn, available to defend the next position, the next island, in the long, grinding retreat toward Japan. For the crew of the USS Chevalier, the battle did not end at 2330. Their ship was sinking, her bow blown off, her engine rooms flooded, fires burning amidships. Captain Briscoe gave the order to abandon ship at 2320, and the crew went over the side into warm, oil-slicked water. The Taylor came alongside to pick up survivors, a dangerous operation in darkness, with the possibility that Japanese destroyers might return. At 2350, with all living crew members evacuated, the Chevalier was sinking by the bow, her stern rising out of the water, propellers turning slowly in air. Captain Briscoe, the last man off, watched from the Taylor's deck as his ship died. At 2358, the Chevalier slipped beneath the surface, bow first, taking with her 54 men and adding another name to the long list of American destroyers lost in the Solomons. The Selfridge, missing her entire bow, somehow managed to steam backward toward Tulagi, where she would undergo emergency repairs before being towed to a shipyard. Her survival was a testament to the toughness of Fletcher-class destroyer construction and the skill of her damage control parties. She would be repaired, returned to service, and fight again, though her 54 dead would never be replaced. The O'Bannon, with her crushed bow and damaged hull, also made it back to Tulagi. She would be repaired more quickly than the Selfridge, and would return to the war in time to participate in the invasion of the Philippines. For the sailors on these ships, the Battle of Vella Lavella was a brutal reminder that technological superiority did not guarantee victory, that Japanese torpedoes were still deadly, that courage and skill on the enemy side still mattered. The Americans had better radar, better fire control, better logistics. But the Japanese still had excellent weapons, experienced crews, and a willingness to fight at close range where American advantages were minimized. The Japanese destroyer Yugumo sank at 2305, taking most of her crew with her. She had been hit multiple times by American 5-inch shells, her hull punctured, her machinery shattered. But she had launched her torpedoes before sinking, and those torpedoes had crippled 2 American destroyers and sunk a third. Her sacrifice had bought time for the evacuation to succeed, which meant, by the calculus of Japanese naval doctrine, that her loss was acceptable. For the survivors of the Yugumo, perhaps 50 men pulled from the water by other Japanese destroyers during the withdrawal, the battle was both a victory and a defeat. They had accomplished their mission. The troops had been evacuated, but they had lost their ship, their shipmates, and the tactical engagement. They had been detected first, hit first, forced to fight at a disadvantage because the Americans had radar and they did not. One survivor, interviewed after the war, described the battle. "We knew they could see us before we could see them. We knew their radar gave them an advantage. But what could we do? We had our orders, we had our duty. So we fought, and we died, and we hoped it mattered. It did matter, but not in the way he meant. The evacuation of Vella Lavella succeeded, but it did not change the strategic situation. The Americans simply moved to the next island, the next objective, the next step in their methodical advance. The Japanese, having expended ships and men to save 589 soldiers, would have to expend more ships and men to defend those soldiers at the next position. It was attrition warfare, and attrition warfare favored the side with more resources. By October 1943, that side was unquestionably the United States. The sound that defined the Battle of Vella Lavella, more than gunfire or explosions, was the thunder of destroyer engines pushed to maximum power. The Fletcher-class destroyers that fought the battle were powered by geared turbines, producing 60,000 shaft horsepower, driving them to speeds over 30 knots. At full power, the sound was a deep, throbbing roar that could be heard for miles. Across calm water, a mechanical thunder that announced American presence, American power, American industrial capacity. The Japanese destroyers made similar sounds. Their engines were equally powerful, their ships equally fast. But there was a qualitative difference. American destroyers were being produced at a rate of multiple ships per month by 1943. Japanese destroyers were being produced at a fraction of that rate. Every Japanese destroyer lost was a ship that could not be replaced in time to affect the war's outcome. Every American destroyer lost was mourned, but replacement ships were already under construction, already being fitted out, already preparing to join the fleet. This was the sound of industrial warfare. Not the clash of armies, but the grinding of production schedules, the launching of hulls, the commissioning of ships faster than the enemy could sink them. It was a thunder that grew louder as the war progressed, drowning out the smaller, quieter sounds of individual courage and sacrifice. The Japanese heard this thunder and understood what it meant. They heard it at Guadalcanal, at Kula Gulf, at Colombangara, at Vella Lavella. They heard it growing louder, more pervasive, inescapable, and they knew that no amount of courage, no brilliance of tactics, no superiority of individual weapons could overcome it. But they fought anyway, because that was their duty, and because the alternative, surrender, dishonor, was worse than death. After the Battle of Vella Lavella, the Solomon Islands campaign effectively ended. The Americans had secured Vella Lavella, bypassed Colombangara, and established air and naval bases that threatened Bougainville, the next major objective. The Japanese, having successfully evacuated their garrisons, withdrew their major naval forces from the southern Solomons, consolidating at Rabaul and preparing to defend the next line of islands. There would be more battles, the invasion of Bougainville, the raid on Rabaul, the long struggle for the Bismarcks. But there would be no more major surface engagements in the Solomons. The night gun battles that had characterized the campaign, Savo Island, Cape Esperance, Guadalcanal, Kula Gulf, Colombangara, Vella Lavella, were over. The era of destroyer and cruiser actions, of close-range torpedo duels and point-blank gunnery, was ending. The future belonged to aircraft carriers, to submarine interdiction, to amphibious assaults supported by overwhelming firepower. The officers who had learned their trade in the Solomons, men like Arleigh Burke, who would command destroyer squadrons, at Bougainville, or Raymond Spruance, who would command carrier task forces in the Central Pacific, carried forward the lessons of the night battles. They understood that radar was decisive, that aggressive action was necessary, that technological advantages had to be exploited ruthlessly. These lessons would shape American naval doctrine for the rest of the war and beyond. The Japanese officers who survived the Solomons carried different lessons. They understood that courage was not enough, that superior weapons could not compensate for inferior numbers, that tactical victories meant nothing if the strategic situation continued to deteriorate. Some became cautious, defensive, reluctant to risk ships that could not be replaced. Others became more aggressive, embracing death as preferable to slow defeat. Both responses would characterize Japanese naval operations in 1944 and 1945. In the months after Vella Lavella, The wrecks of the Chevalier and Hugumo settled into the mud of the sea floor, 3,000 feet down, in darkness so complete that no light had reached them since they sank. Coral would eventually grow over the steel, fish would make homes in the wreckage, and the ocean would reclaim what had been temporarily removed from its domain. But in October 1943, those wrecks were fresh, the dead were newly mourned, and the survivors were processing what they had experienced. For the Americans, Vella Lavella was a reminder that the war was not yet won, that the Japanese were still dangerous, that every battle carried the risk of death, no matter how superior American technology and resources had become. For the Japanese, Vella Lavella was proof that they could still fight effectively, still accomplish tactical objectives, still inflict damage on the enemy. But it was also proof that tactical success meant less and less as the strategic situation deteriorated. They had evacuated 589 troops. The Americans would land 60,000 on Bougainville a month later. They had sunk one destroyer and damaged two. The Americans would replace those losses with newly constructed ships within weeks. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. One Japanese officer, writing in his diary after the evacuation, captured the paradox. "We fought well. We accomplished our mission. We saved our soldiers. And yet I feel that we are losing, that each success only delays the inevitable. The Americans have more ships, more planes, more of everything. How do we fight that? How do we win when the enemy can lose and still be stronger than before?" There was no answer to that question. Or rather, the answer was that Japan could not win, not in the conventional sense of imposing its will on the enemy and forcing favorable peace terms. The best Japan could hope for was to make victory so expensive that the Americans would negotiate rather than continue the slaughter. But that strategy depended on American willingness to accept a negotiated peace, and by October 1943, it was clear that no such willingness existed. The Americans would fight until Japan surrendered unconditionally, no matter the cost. The survivors of the Chevalier, pulled from the water by the USS Taylor, were taken to Tulagi and then evacuated to rear area bases for medical treatment and reassignment. Some would return to combat on other ships. Others, too badly wounded or too psychologically damaged, would spend the rest of the war in hospitals or administrative positions. All carried with them the memory of the night their ship was blown apart by a torpedo they never saw coming, fired by an enemy they never saw. In a battle that lasted less than an hour, one sailor, interviewed decades later, was asked what he remembered most about the Battle of Vella Lavella. He paused for a long time before answering. "The sound," he finally said. "The sound of the torpedo hitting, the explosion, the ship breaking apart. And then the sound of men in the water calling for help in the darkness. And the sound of the engines, our ships, their ships, all making that same thunder. You couldn't tell who was who. Everything was just sound and darkness and chaos. And then it was over and we were in the water and the ships were gone and it was quiet. That's what I remember. The quiet after the thunder stopped. The Battle of Vella Lavella marked the end of a phase of the Pacific War, the phase where the outcome was uncertain, where Japanese skill and courage could still win tactical victories, where battles were contests rather than foregone conclusions. After Vella Lavella, the trajectory was clear. The Americans would advance island by island toward Japan. The Japanese would resist, inflicting casualties, delaying the advance, but ultimately unable to stop it. The strategic lessons of the Solomons campaign were absorbed by both sides. The Americans learned that bypassing strong points was more efficient than reducing them through direct assault, that air and naval power could isolate enemy garrisons, that radar and superior numbers could overcome enemy tactical advantages. The Japanese learned that dispersed defense was futile, that their naval forces could not contest American control of the sea, that their best hope was to make each American advance as costly as possible. These lessons would shape the campaigns of 1944 and 1945, the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each would follow a similar pattern. American forces landing with overwhelming support, Japanese defenders fighting to the death, American casualties heavy but acceptable given the strategic objective. The thunder of naval guns, which had been so prominent in the Solomons, would continue, but it would be joined by the thunder of bombs from carrier aircraft, artillery barrages from land-based guns, and eventually the unimaginable thunder of atomic weapons. But in October 1943, at Vella Lavella, the thunder was still the old kind, the thunder of destroyer engines, of 5-inch guns, of battles fought at close range in darkness by men who could barely see their enemies. It was the last of its kind in the Solomons, and when it faded, an era faded with it. There is a small memorial on Vella Lavella, erected by the islanders who watched the battles from shore, who hid in the jungle during air raids, who rescued Allied and Japanese sailors who washed up on their beaches. The memorial lists the ships that fought in the waters around the island: American, Japanese, Australian, New Zealand. It lists the dates of the battles: August 15th, September 7th, October 6th. It thanks the Allied forces for liberating the island and acknowledges the Japanese forces who fought and died there. Few people visit the memorial. Vella Lavella is remote, accessible only by small boat, inhabited by a few hundred people who live as their ancestors did, fishing and farming, largely untouched by the modern world. The war passed through their island like a storm, devastating and brief, and when it ended, the jungle reclaimed the airfields and bases, covering the scars with green, but the wrecks remain on the sea floor, and the memories remain in the stories told by the elders. And the memorial remains as a reminder that for a brief period in 1943, this small island was the focus of great powers, the site of battles that helped determine the outcome of the largest war in human history. The strategic significance of Vella Lavella was not in its possession, but in what its possession represented: the systematic American advance, island by island, toward Japan. Each island taken was a step closer, a base for the next advance, a demonstration that Japanese defenses could be bypassed and neutralized without direct assault. Each evacuation, and Vella Lavella was the last major successful Japanese evacuation in the Solomons, demonstrated that Japan was in retreat, that the defensive perimeter was contracting, that ultimate defeat was approaching. The Japanese High Command understood this. They watched the map as American-controlled territory expanded: Guadalcanal, then the Russell Islands, then New Georgia, then Vella Lavella, then Bougainville. They watched their own territory shrink: Rabaul isolated, the Bismarcks threatened, the Marianas vulnerable. They calculated how long they could hold, how many ships they could afford to lose, how many men they could sacrifice before collapse became inevitable. The calculations were grim. By October 1943, Japan had lost more than half its trained carrier pilots, irreplaceable losses that meant American air superiority would only grow. Japan's merchant fleet was being devastated by American submarines, strangling the flow of raw materials from the conquered territories. Japan's industrial production, never close to American levels, was falling further behind as American factories reached peak efficiency. The Battle of Vella Lavella, in this context, was a minor tactical action with no strategic significance. 600 soldiers evacuated, 1 destroyer lost on each side, a few hours of combat, barely worth mentioning in the grand scheme of the war. But it was the last of its kind, the final major surface engagement in a campaign that had forged the modern U.S. Navy. And that gave it a symbolic importance beyond its tactical results. October 6, 1943. 22:30 hours. The waters west of Vella Lavella Island. The night is black silk. The sea moves in long swells, phosphorescence trailing from ships cutting through darkness. On the bridge of the USS Selfridge, Captain Walker watches his radar screen, tracking enemy ships he cannot see with eyes, only with electronics. His destroyers race toward battle, engines thundering, crews at battle stations, weapons ready. In 20 minutes, his ship will lose her bow to a Japanese torpedo. 54 of his men will die. But in this moment, racing toward the enemy, he believes in his ship, his weapons, his mission. He believes that American technology and training will prevail, that the battle will be won, that the war is moving inexorably toward Allied victory. He is correct about the war. But tonight, the battle will be a draw, a bloody mutual mauling that accomplishes little, except to prove that war is unpredictable, that technology cannot guarantee safety, that brave men die in causes both just and unjust. The radar pings, the range closes, the guns prepare to fire, and somewhere ahead in the darkness, Japanese destroyers approach, their own crews at battle stations, their own officers believing in their mission, their own fate rushing toward them at 30 knots. The thunder begins, engines, guns, explosions, the mechanical roar of industrial warfare. It will last less than an hour. It will sink ships and kill hundreds. It will accomplish tactical objectives on both sides and change nothing strategically. And then it will fade, the last major surface engagement in the Solomons. The last time these waters will hear the thunder of destroyer guns in night battle. The last echo of an era ending. The sound fades across the decades, across the years that separate that night from this moment, across the gulf between the men who fought and died and the world they fought to shape. It fades but does not disappear. It remains in the memories of survivors, in the records of historians, in the wrecks on the sea floor, in the small memorial on a remote island where villagers remember the night the thunder came to their waters, and then, after a brief violent storm, faded away, leaving behind only silence and the eternal sound of waves. October 6th, 1943, the last major surface engagement. The final thunder, the sound of an era ending, fading into the darkness, replaced by the new sounds of a new kind of warfare, carrier aircraft, strategic bombing, amphibious assaults on an unprecedented scale. The old thunder fades, the new thunder rises, and the war continues, island by island, mile by mile, until there is no more distance left to cross, no more ocean left to sail, no more enemies left to fight. The thunder of Vella Lavella fades into history, its sound preserved only in memory, a reminder that all eras end, all battles cease. All thunder eventually falls silent, but the silence, when it comes, carries its own weight, the weight of sacrifice, of courage, of men who fought in darkness for causes they believed in, with weapons they trusted, against enemies they respected even as they tried to kill them. The sound of thunder fading. The last battle, the end of something that cannot be replaced, will not return, exists now only as echo and memory and the eternal question. What did it mean? What did we accomplish? What did we lose in the winning? The thunder fades, the darkness remains. The sea rolls on, indifferent, eternal, remembering nothing, preserving everything in its depths where light does not reach and sound does not carry, and time moves differently, if it moves at all. October 6, 1943, the last thunder. The sound of an ending, the Battle of Vella Lavella.